Well, to discuss, let's bring in Richard Johnson, lecturer in US politics at the Queen Mary University of London. Thank you so much for joining us here on France 24. We're seeing that the presidential race will most likely come down to voters in 8 states that remain competitive, according to some recent polls. Paint us a picture of where we're at in this election.
Well, if we look at the battleground states, no candidate has pulled ahead. I mean, the states that I'm focusing on are in the Rust Belt, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, and then what I might call the broad Sun Belt, North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, Nevada. And in all of these cases, the polling averages are +1, +2, +3, or dead even. And that just means to say that basically the probability in each of these states is a flip of a coin. Now, it's not to say that the election itself will come down to a very narrow electoral college majority. It could be that one candidate sweeps all 7 of those states. In 2016, Donald Trump won 6 out of those 7. In 2020, Joe Biden won 6 out of those 7. And anything in between is possible. I think that some people, Democrats in particular, are where there is a bit of panic, is a perception that they felt that there had been forward momentum with their campaign when Kamala Harris first came in and replaced Joe Biden. But what's happened is that momentum has stalled. That's not to say that she's fallen backwards. She has improved from where Biden had been over the summer, but she's not been able to pull away from Donald Trump. Now, I'm not terribly surprised by this because this is a very polarized electorate and people's partisan attachments are very strong. So we shouldn't expect to see a great deal of movement. But all that means to say is that this election is going to be won in the very finest of margins in this group of half a dozen swing states.
And what are the polls concerning, the different minorities, and how is the vote by this electorate so crucial in this election?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion in the last few weeks about the Democrats perhaps losing ground with traditional minority communities, particularly African Americans and Latino voters. The New York Times does a really great in-depth poll with Siena College, and their latest iteration that came out this month showed that Harris is on about 81% of the vote with African Americans, which is actually an improvement from where the situation had been a few months ago. It was looking like the Democrats were more like sort of 75%. Still, 81% is about 10 points less than has been the case in most presidential elections in recent times. Usually the Democrats can get about 90% of the vote. Obama got 95% of the black vote in 2012. Harris isn't going to get anywhere close to that. But really where the Democrats have lost ground is with the Latino electorate. Trump at the moment, it's looking like he's certainly about 40 or 40%, 41, 42% with Latino voters. This would be the second highest support for a Republican candidate among Latino voters in the last half century. Only George W. Bush in 2004 did a bit better. He got, I think, 44% of the vote with Latinos then. But I should also point out that's the only election, 2004, where the Republicans won the popular vote since 1988. So the fact that Trump is basically matching George W. Bush's levels with Latino voters is some sign of concern for Democrats.
I want to hold you on that point that, Kamala Harris is really having to fight for the Black and Hispanic vote who have, as you said, traditionally leaned towards the Democratic Party. What's your reading on the reason behind this?
Well, some of it is a long-term shift where I think one thing for people to keep in mind is that there has always been a significant ideologically conservative element in both the Latino and African American electorates. These are ideologically diverse groups. People have differences of opinion. Depending on how you poll the question, about a third of African Americans for many election cycles now have identified as being conservative. And yet about 3/4 of Black conservatives have continued to vote for the Democrats. And I think what we might be seeing in this election is a movement of some, still possibly not even a majority, but some conservative Black voters leaving the Democrats and voting Republican. And this fits into a wider change which is occurring in the American electorate, which has been going on now for a generation, which is that ideology and party choice are matching up much more closely. I should also just say, because we've been talking a lot about minority voters, but white voters have actually been moving in the Democratic direction. In the same New York Times Siena poll, Kamala Harris was at about 43% support with white voters, which is what Barack Obama got in 2008 when he won a substantial popular vote and electoral college vote majority in that election. And I think that the reason for that is that ideologically liberal, college-educated white voters are moving away from the Republican Party because they disagree with certain Republican policies, particularly on something like abortion, and they're moving into the Democratic Party column. So there's two-way movement that's going on in this election.
And immigration and abortion are obviously at the forefront on voters' minds, but what are some of the other key issues at stake here for Americans?
Well, the top issue in the polls is the economy. And this hasn't really changed throughout the election. Now, voters have different reads on the economy, but of course, one of the challenges that the Harris campaign has had is that the issue of inflation has been very difficult to dislodge. It's not the case that inflation today in America is especially high. It's returned to kind of historic norm. But there was a period at the start of the Biden presidency when inflation was quite high. And the issue is that even after you get inflation stabilized, the prices don't go down. They just stop rising as quickly as before. And so this has been, I think, in some ways the killer issue for Trump against the Democrats, an issue that he has had some advantage on, is that he has been able to say to Americans, when I was president, the price of a cheeseburger or price of gas when you fill up your car was lower than it was now. And of course, in a sense, that's true. But it's not the case that when Trump becomes president, he'll be able to get those prices much further down from where they are now. But the economy, I think, is the major issue. Also, interestingly, if you look at the polling, people mention democracy. And I think both Republicans and Democrats interpret that in different ways. But of course, we shouldn't forget that there are many voters who are concerned about the condition of American democracy. For Democrats, they think of the situation on the 6th of January and Trump's denial of the previous election. Republican voters talk about concerns about voter fraud and so on. So it's interesting that this is certainly an issue that is detectable in the polls, but it's quite nebulous as to how different voters interpret it.
All right, Richard Johnson from the Queen Mary University of London, thank you so much for sharing your views here on France 24.
Thank you.